welcome everyone. My name is Derek Hosberg. I am the program director at Reimagine. And we're so excited to have you here for holding space with Claire Bidwell Smith and Marisa Renee Lee, who already I am very excited to hear more about. Just for those who are new to Reimagine, Reimagine is a nonprofit that catalyzes community experiences like this one that really explore some of the hardest parts of our existence while celebrating life and one another. And before I pass it off to Claire and Marisa, I am just going to do a little housekeeping. And first, I just want to thank our 2021 Reimagine sponsors who are shown here and support Reimagine and really help make this work possible. I also just want to thank all of you who've donated to Reimagine, because that really is what keeps us going. So thank you. So Claire, who has been hosting these events for the past year with so many amazing people, and really is one of the highlights of my week. She is a grief therapist and author of 3 wonderful books that I recommend checking out. And I will be pasting her bio as well as Marisa's in the chat in just a moment. And then Marisa is a writer, a speaker, and also the co-founder of Supportal, which you will learn about in just a bit. So with that, I will pass it off to Claire.
Thank you so much, Dara. Thanks, Reimagine, as always. And oh my gosh, you guys, I am really excited to be here with Marisa today. I think I just want to hang out with Marisa all the time, and I haven't done it enough, and I'm so excited. And so we'll just do this publicly. It's gonna be
I love it.
I have so many questions and so many things I want to talk to you about. And your background and everything that you do there's just so much. You do so many incredible things. You've done so many incredible things. In some ways, I'm not sure where to start. I was just looking at a picture of you in the Oval Office with Obama. Like, I've read so many of your beautiful essays. We've been on MSNBC together. There's just so much. Where I would like to kind of just have you start. And I know for me, all of my work is informed from a personal place. And I know that that is true for you as well. So maybe that's the place to start.
Yeah.
If you want to go there.
That sounds great. That sounds great. So first of all, thank you for having me. And, I just want to say, for folks who have not engaged with Claire personally, she's someone who a friend thought I should be following on social media. I started following her, fell in love with her work and her words. And then when I ended up almost a year ago now, getting a book deal, I reached out and asked if she would talk to me and give me some advice. And she is one of those people who picks up the phone and says, absolutely, of course. So I've been grateful to have her as a book writing and grief cheerleader for the last year. So thank you, Claire.
I'm so glad you found me.
And thank you, my girlfriend, Lizzie, who's actually on right now, who thought that I should know you. I am with you in that everything that I do in the world is informed by my personal experiences. Growing up, my mom got sick one day and she just never got better. It turned out she had multiple sclerosis. And then when I was graduating from college, 12 years later, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. We lost her about 3 years into her battle. She was amazing. She was, both, mom and best friend. And then, I was also one of her caretakers. My father was around, but he worked. And, I wanted to do whatever I could to help my mom and, keep her comfortable and happy and as healthy as possible. And so when I lost her, I just turned 25. I was working in finance and running a charity at the same time, because that's just what I tend to do in the world, apparently. One job is not enough. I suddenly felt like, what am I doing with my life? What if I end up like my mom? She was sick at 37 and dead by 49. And it shook me. It's scary when you're that age. I mean, obviously, and you lose a parent, it just changes your perspective on everything. And so I thought about what I might want to do if I could have any job in the world. And I said, I want to go work for the first Black president, and harassed a bunch of people until someone gave me a job here in DC. And at the time, I told all my friends in New York, I'll be back in 2 years. That was 11 years ago. I, of course, like did the Obama thing, and then met a guy and got married. And now we live in the suburbs with this dog who's at my feet right now. So you may hear her at some point. And it's been an amazing journey. I spent 7 years working for the former president in different capacities, including in the White House. And it was amazing, but I reached a point where I realized I wanted to spend more time thinking about and writing about grief and loss in my experiences, because through my time in DC, I ended up learning that, probably in part from the trauma and stress that I experienced around my mother's end of life and loss, I had developed an underlying health condition that led to infertility. So I was constantly coming back to these grief themes, no matter how far away I tried to get from them, and ended up, as you mentioned, starting Supportal, which is a platform where we share stories of the worst things that happened to people and how other people showed up for them, as a way of inspiring you to take action, to show up in a way that's truly meaningful for the people in your community when something terrible happens. And so, started Supportal. I felt like I had the grief stuff under control for a little while, but as you know, that is never actually the case. My husband and I experienced a pregnancy loss in 2019 that put me into this whole new grief space. I don't know if you've had, Claire, like any health issues, but there's just something different when you're both trying to process emotional and psychological pain and also physical pain. And it was just too much. And then 2020 hit and we all went into lockdown and George Floyd and everything else. And all I could do was write my way through it. And that led to us getting to know each other better and a book deal and all this other grief work that I'm doing now. So yeah, it's been a journey, but every step of the way informed by these very personal experiences.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that's the fascinating thing about hardship and grief and loss and these things that we go through. They power our lives in some ways, right? Like both of my parents were gone by the time I was 25. So I was also like in a similar position to you, but it made me just like insatiable for life, like how much can I get out of my time here?
Yeah.
And it made me take risks. It makes me take risks. It makes me just like want to soak up everything I can, even though I'm terrified all the time of living. This weird duality, right? Like I'm constantly terrified of life and yet want to get as much of it as I can. Which I think is amazing. I'm grateful for that, and I think that there's so many layers to all of us going through that, even just the pandemic and the last year. But that's been an experience that I think for all of us was a huge wake up call. Like, whoa, like kind of we were just all humming along as a species, and then there's this wake up call, like, wait, and everyone really kind of forced to evaluate. Is my life meaningful? Am I living the way I want to be living? And that's kind of amazing, right? To be able to be confronted with that.
I mean, I honestly think the pandemic moment is what led to people being in a place where they could, question their privilege and, really think more intentionally about race and racism in this country. Like, I think if not for that collective grief that we were all experiencing, it probably wouldn't have happened, honestly.
Absolutely. So racism is a huge thing that I want to talk to you about today. I also want to talk to you about grief in the administration of Biden's. We'll get to that in a little bit. But let's talk about racism. But there's a few places that I would love to go, and then I want to wherever you want to go too. But grieving the events of last week, last year, like all these different things that are happening. So that's a grief, right? But then I also want to talk about kind kind of bias and racism in the death care industry and in the grief
Mm,
industry, but like the clinical grief world and the
yeah.
death care industry. So those are places I'm really like constantly wanting to hear more about and curious about and wanting to talk about. So wherever
Yes
you
to
kind of
all of
jump
it.
in.
Yes to all of the above. So I'm going to start with the second piece first and just some thoughts. It is something I am deeply cognizant of. When my mom was dying, and, even more recently when I was going through my pregnancy loss, it's really hard for people of color to find resources that they can identify with.
Yeah, it's a
Like,
lot of white people in the grief world, the
and
clinical world.
it's tough because I think the grief world is simply a slice of the world at large, for better or worse.
Of
When
course,
you
yeah,
are, when you're looking for leaders and experts, they tend to be white. And so that is one of the things that has come up for me a lot in the last year. Lots of people of color reaching out and saying, for the first time I felt like you were somebody who I could identify with, your story, your experiences, the way that you write about grief. And I'm grateful for that. It's sad. Again, the duality of these things, like it's frustrating. But I think people are really trying to be as inclusive as possible right now. And I just hope that it sticks.
yeah.
Um, because it is, it's problematic. But again, I think the grief industry is similar to so many others, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Inclusive is like, it doesn't mean just talking about it. It means we
Yeah,
really need a lot more voices and representation in these spaces,
yeah.
like, I think that like when I look at the clinical grief world, it's a lot of white men, then a bunch of white women, and then that's kind of it, like the way it's kind of tiered out so far.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and that does not at all represent this country, this what people are
No,
going through,
yeah.
and the white experience of grief is not everyone else's
Well,
experience of grief.
and the thing that I have been thinking about more and more, because, as we lost my cousin Ebony to COVID
Mhm.
back in October. She was 35 years old. And for my aunt, and I can't remember if I told you this is the third child that she's lost. She lost a son to cancer when he was like 10 years old. And then
Oh,
she lost a son to gun violence. So like I was also in trying to support her from afar, and she's never been for any therapy until a couple of weeks ago when I helped her find someone who she felt like she could identify with, and she's having an amazing experience and I'm so happy. But it just forced me to take a step back and realize, the fact that the grief community is so white is problematic, because at the end of the day, Black people tend to experience more death and more things to grieve. And so, doing the work to diversify that space, like it will have a very real impact on people's lives.
yeah, absolutely. And it has to happen in the end of life space too. I was just reading, the grave woman, Joelle Anthony.
No.
Do you know who she is? Oh, she's great. She's a funeral end of life space, but she's had some really good webinars lately. You should follow her on Instagram, The Grave Woman. Her name is Joelle. You can put it in the chat somewhere. Maybe Derek can look her up. But she was talking a lot about just racial bias in the death care, like in the funeral home planning, like
Oh
space
God.
and like all of that, and not being able to find just spaces where you feel represented. And so I think that there's so
Yeah.
many different places where it needs to change. And do you know Pastor Corey Kennard? I love
Yeah.
him. We were talking about just the kind of a lot of the distrust that happens in the medical communities and those medical settings, and
I
that being
mean,
such a huge issue.
that is especially, obviously, the vaccine hesitancy is an issue that is plaguing minority communities right now. And it is absolutely devastating to me, because we also know Black people have been dying at a disproportionate rate from COVID since it started. And with the Johnson and Johnson news, I mean, it's upsetting. On my list of things today is to post the vaccine pictures from when I got my shot, and my dad, bless his heart, thought to take pictures of both himself and my grandmother when she got her shot.
Aw.
Because, you know, like we need to be a part of telling the story that like it's okay to get this vaccine. You know, it's not going to do anything bad to you. Yeah, it's hard.
But I mean that I you know that distrust is built upon years and years of problematic, you know, issues. So so yeah, so what about grieving racism?
Yes, this is something that I don't think I made the connection between racism and grief until last spring.
Hmm.
You know, I have
For a lot of
experienced,
people, yeah.
yeah, and I mean, obviously I've experienced racism personally, you know, directly many times over the years. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, you don't even talk about it, like you don't even tell anybody, because it's just, if you're Black, it's kind of like, well, that's just what happens sometimes.
Mhm.
And if you tell a white person, it's just like, it's just uncomfortable and like it's awkward and it's weird. And then George Floyd happened, and I remember one of my girlfriends texted me, it was like, you know, how are you doing? I'm just checking in. And I was like, I'm fine. It's just America being America, you know, whatever. I was literally kind of just like, whatever. Fast forward a couple hours later, when I actually had a chance to process it, I still have never seen the video. I don't need to watch it.
Mhm.
And I was a wreck. And I woke up the next morning and started writing the piece on Black grief and racism as another form of grief, because, you know, fundamentally, grief is about figuring out how to live your life after experiencing a significant loss, right? And racism is figuring out how to live your life in this world where, you know, not everybody wants you. Like that is a loss.
Mhm.
It is a significant loss. And so, you know, I think it's really important for those of us who know grief to think about racism in that way, because I think it is the kind of framing that helps people figure out how to respond and what to do. And it's awkward, just like it's awkward when, you know, somebody dies and you're, you know, what do I say? What do I do? It is uncomfortable because unfortunately, like it should be, you know, like it will, I will tell you, you know, I put myself in the allyship camp, and I, you know, newly vaccinated, went to get wax the other day, you know, like went to my salon and I saw Annie and she's Asian American. And this was a couple days after everything that happened in Atlanta. And I was like, how are you doing? You know, do you feel safe as like a business owner in this area? And it was awkward, but it felt important. So yeah,
Totally.
so
It's
applying.
similar to when someone dies and people don't know what to
Yeah,
say. They're
yeah.
so afraid to say the wrong thing that they don't say anything at all,
And
right?
that is the worst thing you can do. Like,
Exactly.
I don't know about you. There were definitely some people that said some misguided things when my mom died and when we experienced our pregnancy loss. You know, have you thought about adoption? Like, yes, we've heard of adoption. Thank you. But you can let those things go, or you just forget about them. You never forget about the people who you expect to say something who don't say anything at all. Like
That's so
that.
true. It's so true. Yeah.
So
I still like immediately flashed to mind standing
yeah,
in a parking lot with my ex-boyfriend from high school like a month after my mom died, and he didn't say anything, and
yeah.
he like loved her, they'd been friends and close, and I still like immediately flashed to it, and that was what 23 years ago, you know, like you're
You
right.
remember that? Yeah,
And that applies to racism, that applies to
yeah,
talking, we had these hard conversations, you know,
yeah.
same thing. Yeah. So how do you grieve? How do you move through that kind of grief?
Um, you know, I pull out my list of coping mechanisms that I'm sure you have by now as well. And it's the same stuff that I've been doing for years with a couple of edits. You know, I am someone, I'm looking at my Peloton right now. You know, I have my dog at my feet. Like she's always a great source of comfort. I am meditation, therapy. I've been going to acupuncture. Like I will do whatever is going to help. And I even had a therapist friend say that a really good piece of chocolate cake can be considered self-care. You know, like I do all of the things. I would say this, like what I have learned over the years and I'm sure with your therapist hat on, you will agree, I am trying to be better at not getting upset with myself for being upset. Like I think about how much time we all waste, being frustrated about whatever the feelings are that are coming up, as opposed to just letting them come up, naming them and moving through them. So
Yeah.
I've been trying to be better about that. And then I've also been trying to create more space in the middle of a crazy workday. Even if it's just a 5-minute meditation break, or 10 minutes outside throwing the ball for the dog, just something to pull me out of the insanity and like become present again. So yeah, those are some of mine, but what are some of yours?
Yeah, I mean, that idea of permission, giving myself permission to feel it, giving myself permission to fall apart, giving myself permission to be a mess over it, giving myself permission to, you know, have an extended period of time of
Yeah,
grieving. I think that that's something people really feel like they need to wrap it up pretty
yeah,
quickly. And that's not possible for certain losses, certain griefs, certain people. So yeah, again, kind of going to that space and giving myself permission looks like a lot of self-compassion, which is hard,
yeah.
really
I am
hard.
terrible at it. I
I
am
think so
terrible
hard.
at it. I mean, I can give you like a list of 10 things right now that I've done wrong today alone. You know what I mean? Like,
But giving me a list of 10 things you've done right is harder, right? Like,
yeah,
so yeah. But in terms of like honoring grief over racial injustice or George Floyd or, you know, all these, every police shooting that's happened in the
yeah.
last, you know, forever. How do you kind of honor that grief? I've heard I've heard an answer at some point recently that was you can't grieve that until it stops. Like there's
Oh gosh, that's interesting.
yeah, I can't remember if I heard that or someone told it to me specifically who it was, but the answer was that like there's no space for grief yet because I'm still too angry and it hasn't stopped and I don't feel safe enough to grieve.
Yeah, I am forcing myself to carve out space for these feelings of grief that you experience every time something like this happens. And for me, I write obviously for work purposes, but I also do just a lot of writing for processing. So like that is one of the things that I will take time out to do, because I often need that to help me figure out like what is it that I'm feeling. Like it's not just rage. What else is there?
Yeah.
And what do I want to do about it? And sometimes it's just, again, these little self-care things and rest and being good to my body, and just honoring what I feel like I need. I think you saw this. I wrote recently on some of these like really hard days, I just want one of those really stupid bro comedy movies. The Hangover is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Wedding
Like
Crashers
that's like
is my Wedding Crashers is my top favorite.
that's like you just need some like Will Ferrell or Zach Galifianakis or something just to like let it go. Because I'll tell you, when I started going to acupuncture again a couple months ago, she asked me what did I do for fun. And I started listing all of these things. I jump on my Peloton, take the dog for a long walk, I might take a nap, whatever. And she's like, that's not fun. Like that's relaxation. She's like, you have to be able to distinguish between fun and relaxation, because your body needs both and they serve different purposes. So ever since then, I've been trying to laugh more. And now that we're vaccinated, see more people.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think there's a fine line between permission to grieve and like really steeping in it. I think we have
Yeah.
to really let ourselves grieve and enter into those spaces, and then also really give ourselves positive spaces to exist in and let
Yeah.
that happen sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in the same day. I think sometimes we get caught up and think we should only be grieving, only be sad. But
Yeah.
I think that the balance is really important.
I also think in order for Black people to even begin to heal from all of these things, you need space for rest and recovery and joy. Otherwise, it's just a miserable existence. And I mean, you know that even in the midst of like the hardest, saddest, most depressing or anxious parts of grief, you could still laugh, you know, like you could still have flashes where things were okay. You know, they may have been brief, but it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the current administration. You were part of the last one, or not the last one, thank God. The
Jesus.
one before that. Um, but like, thank God we've moved on from that one, from the Trump administration, because that was an administration that did not give people permission to grieve. It did not create space for that. Did not allow for that. And we've really kind of entered into such a different space now. One of the things that I find really fascinating about Biden is that we don't see a lot of male grief in our culture. And
No.
he is a man who stands up in front of the world and will openly cry and talk about his grief, which is so
Yeah.
awesome. And like, what more could we ask for in this moment of time when people are going through more loss than ever, you know?
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's something really fascinating to me. And I just wonder, like, in your experience, politically, what are you seeing and feeling?
So, first of all, I remember, excuse me, when we did MSNBC together,
Mhm.
it was such a crazy few days because it was when Trump was hospitalized for COVID and he went out and like had that parade, you know, around with his supporters, you know, riding around in the motorcade, waving at people. Like
I'm
it
so glad
just
we can laugh a little bit now at that.
I mean, it was so I think I called it like a COVID parade because I was like, this is so wild. Like this is just not steeped in reality at all. Like I can't believe this is happening miles away from my house. Like what is wrong with the world? And now it feels like even though there is a lot that is a mess and not okay still in this moment, we have the right people in charge.
Yeah.
Obviously, I am deeply, deeply biased as an alum of the Obama Biden administration, but I really, truly believe it. You know, hearing him talk about grief, knowing what that man has been through, like, I don't think we could have found anyone better for right now.
Right?
And
It
I
just
will tell you,
stands.
like it's insane. So I'm going to share a story that I haven't shared publicly because I just, you know, I don't know, it was just kind of a random one. But Matt and I, my husband, we were at the vice president's residence for an event like years ago, and we're usually kind of on the younger end of those types of things. We hadn't seen the vice president in a while, you know, like we'd been there for over an hour and he was just nowhere to be found. And we ended up talking to this guy who seemed to be about our age. And he shared that he had lost his wife to breast cancer just a couple of months prior. You know, this guy's like 40 years old and they have 3 young kids, and talked about how like the Biden family had supported them, you know, through this cancer battle, and that he was at the party because all his kids wanted was to play with the vice president's dog. And so the vice president was nowhere to be found at this event, you know, with like governors and mayors and celebrities and whatever, because he was playing with these 3 little kids and his dog, because that's all they want to. Like, this is the man who's running the country right now. Like, I am so happy. I can't even, I can barely contain myself. And I'm currently putting some like thoughts on paper around like, what does grief policy look like? You know, I
Totally.
know what's
Allison
possible.
Gilbert had a piece in the Washington Post this week about like that she really thinks there needs to be like a bereavement task force in the administration.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
can you find that, Dara? Allison Gilbert had, I think it was the Washington Post. Um, but yeah, I agree. I think, you know, you and I have been talking a lot about this in on the news and public spaces. What kind of like grief epidemic is coming? You know, and this
Yeah.
idea of not feeling safe enough to grieve, I think is true on a certain level. And I think as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, when people start getting vaccinated and stop being so like careful and afraid and living in that space, I think we're going to feel another wave of grief, like when we can kind of finally feel allowed to grieve. Because right now we're still in this like, hyper vigilant state where we can't
Yeah,
quite grieve yet. But I think as we begin to soften as a culture, we're going to grieve even more. And we're still losing people every day.
I know. And here's my concern, and I hope that I'm wrong. So I actually have two concerns that I'll share, not to be totally doom and gloom. One is, I at this point have two young women, 40s, who have been diagnosed with cancer that is like further along than it probably would be otherwise, because so many of us missed out on last year's like annual exams for certain things. So like I, for one, am going to get my mammogram today because it scared me into action. Because, I think there will be this additional toll of illness and unfortunately probably death as like a secondary consequence to COVID that we haven't even begun to like think about or process.
Yeah.
And then I worry a little bit that we could skip over the grieving that people need because people are so eager and excited to just get back to life, like going on vacation, getting your kid in camp, kids back in school, like seeing your loved ones, that I worry that we will leave the people who are grieving behind. And I'm just really cognizant of that and want to do what I can to make sure that that doesn't happen.
What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen? What do you envision we could be doing alongside of celebrating, going back to
Yeah,
regular life? What can we be doing to kind of bolster that grief?
I think given how many people who've been lost, like, first of all, I do think there needs to be some real grief policy out of the administration, and it's possible. I know how those things work, and I believe that they're going to do it, and I'm going to be behind the scenes pushing them to do that. And then I think we all at this point know someone who's lost someone because of COVID. Each of us being really cognizant of that and like taking the time out to check in on them and, putting in your calendar the date for their dead person's birthday, or, like thinking about them around the holidays. We're heading into Mother's Day, which is triggering for both of us and lots of other people for lots of different reasons, thinking about those things and being proactive when it comes to reaching out to them.
Definitely.
So
Jess asks, what would a grief policy look like?
So I actually think it's a series of policies. Like I don't think there's any one thing. Just like we know grief needs a lot of things. Like I don't think one thing is enough. And for me, I've been comparing it to the work that we did in the Obama administration under my brother's keeper. What you can do from within the White House is actually, for better or worse, fairly limited. Like executive power isn't enough to say we're going to have a nationwide bereavement policy, but what they can do is use like the power that comes with simply being in that office to push for other things to happen. So a couple of examples. I think we need a COVID memorial. I think we need a place, ideally here in DC, where, people can gather and see like the names of their loved ones who've been lost and just like have a physical space that speaks to how devastating this period of time has been. So that's one thing that I think needs to happen, that they can push for. I would love to see the White House partner with the private sector to get companies to think differently about bereavement. Because yes, bereavement leave is important, but as you know, and as I know, it's not just about the 2 weeks after someone has died.
Yeah.
It's about you being able to take a long weekend away from work and go on vacation when it's the anniversary of their death, or when it's their birthday, or when something else comes up. Another thing that I've thought about is partnering again with the private sector and with insurance companies to make sure that there is more coverage provided for mental health services and some of the other things that we know can help when you're grieving, like acupuncture and access to different movement therapies and alternative healing, like opportunities and things like that. So I think it's a lot of stuff, but I think it's possible.
Yeah, I think one of the things too is grief education. I think one of the things that
Yeah,
we saw happen with the frontline workers where they were suddenly on, FaceTime with family members, help like watching them say goodbye to people who were dying. I mean, they had no training for that. They had
no,
no experience with that. The grief that they're going through on their own level, and just having to hold that grief and space for dying patients and their families. Um,
I mean, I can't even imagine.
it's not taught though in medical school. Like there's no grief and bereavement taught,
Yeah,
and so that needs to change. I think there's a lot of things that need to change in terms of just education about grief. I think that our culture was really lacking in that, is lacking in that. Danielle says that we're shifting culturally. People talk more about their losses and grief, and it starts with an overall American cultural change. And this is it. It's like this systemic change that needs to happen, though. It's so many different places.
oh my goodness, Tanya, I had 3 days paid bereavement after my son died last October. I am so sorry. That is horrendous.
That
That
is,
is horrendous.
yeah. And one of the things I always remind people or try to inform people about, as a grief therapist, it's been a decade now of this work, that there's always a lot of attention paid to people in the very beginning of a loss, like the first 3 days or the first 3 weeks, people get lots of attention and support. But that's often a period of time when there's tons of people around
Yeah,
helping. There's a lot of shock and denial, and just like you don't even know what's going on. And then the like 6 to 12 month mark is when shit gets really heavy and hard. And then no one's around and no one's paying attention. And people think you should be moving on at that point.
you're
And that's
fine.
the hardest space.
Yeah, you're supposed to be over it, Claire. Obviously, we should both be over it by now.
Yes.
Oh
But
my
like,
God.
again, back to Biden, like you and I, all we do in our work and social media is talk about grief in order to give people permission to grieve. It just
Yes.
blows my mind every
Yes.
time I see him up on a podium talking about grief, because like that is like there's nobody bigger than that to be talking about grief and giving people this permission to grieve. It blows my mind. It's amazing. So I'm so
It's
grateful for that.
and I mean, he speaks from the heart, like he really has lost a tremendous amount when
Oh
you
yeah, no,
think
he
about it.
knows
I
what
mean,
it feels like.
it's wild. So I am again biased, but yeah, I think he is the right leader for this moment.
Totally. I want to open it up to more questions and comments that we can respond to and talk with, but I want to go back up to Danielle's comments earlier when we were talking about racism. And she said, racial grief is also passed from generation to generation, just like alcoholism. The stories of grief and loss regarding racism get told within the family. The stories I'm referring to are, for example, lynchings, daily indignities, slurs, microaggressions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, do you think there's a way to honor that, or like make space for that in a different way than we have been? Or
Yeah, so I will tell you practically something that has happened for me over the last year that I have found super helpful. Excuse me, and this is in the work context. People just taking things off my plate, not waiting for me to ask, not expecting me to ask, because I'm not someone who would have thought to ask, but proactively in the wake of George Floyd, I had multiple people, white people who I work with in my consulting practice, just say, I'm going to finish that memo, or I'm going to take care of that call. You don't need to join. Like, have the 30 minutes to take Sadie for a walk or whatever. So that's like one really practical thing, because it is hard to grieve racism, because to the point that you made previously, like, we're not safe. Like I can be sad about Dante Wright and like feel horrible for his family, but I still have to actively, worry about my 6'3", 230-pound father. You know what I mean? Like, so I think creating actual space for people of color to take a break, even if it's just a brief one, to tend to their feelings, I think is really important.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you could sit and like grieve Dante this week and then feel like you've kind of made some space for that, and then the same thing happens again next week. So it's like this kind of
So
never ending grief that continues and really has no no kind of ending, you know?
It's so crazy. It's so
Yeah.
crazy. And then I don't know, I'm not going to get it quite right, but did you see that there was a connection between, I think it was between Dante Wright and Philando Castile, like also
Didn't
Minneapolis
see
area
that.
had
What
been
was it?
like,
I did.
let me see. I'm going to see
Yeah,
if I can just like find it on my phone real quick.
I did read that. It was
Because
some.
I was just like, wow, like that's a reminder of how
It was
real
like a
it
nurse or something, I think.
yeah.
Oh wait,
I'm
his
gonna find,
girlfriend was one of Dante Wright's counselors.
yeah. And it's just like, wow, like there's just so much of it. And it just happens over and over and over again in our communities. Like yeah, it's wild.
Lindsay has a great comment here, that I was just talking about this yesterday with somebody. She says there's an artificial hierarchy of grief that is also quite challenging, i.e. determining whose loss is greater than another's and how much people are allowed to grieve. And like, this is so
Yeah,
important. I call it grief shaming, where somebody
yeah.
will, and I've, I see it everywhere. And it's also kind of goes hand in hand with that toxic positivity. Like I would
Oh
post
God.
something on Instagram about how I was like struggling during, some month last year. And then somebody would immediately, like 5 people would immediately be like, oh, but don't forget to like, feel gratitude for everything you have.
No,
And
shut up. Just let me struggle.
I'm like, no, of course I am. I feel gratitude and all I do is think about other people who have it worse, but I also get to have my feelings, and don't
Yeah,
take that away from people. And
no.
the grief shaming, because Danielle is also talking up here about disenfranchised grief. And that's where I think some of this grief shaming comes in. People are grieving their kids being home from school. People are grieving postponing
Yeah,
weddings. People are grieving loss of jobs. And then people are saying, oh no, you can't grieve that. You have to grieve this, or this loss
no.
is bigger than that one.
It's all grief. And I mean, I am guilty of doing it to myself, comparing pregnancy loss grief versus like losing my mom grief. And like, I have to even remind myself, like, no, they're different experiences. They're both grief. They're both horrendous and they're different, and that's okay. So yeah, the hierarchy of grief and the toxic positivity stuff, I'm just like, I don't have time for it. No.
Yeah. I mean, it really it hurts people and it shames them, for the experiences they're having, and I mean, I talk about grief and my grief all the time out loud, and then every once in a while, like, somebody put a comment on one of my Instagram posts recently that said I'm just trying to monetize my parents' death.
Oh, I saw that. I was so hot on your
You had a good
behalf.
comment.
I
But
was
like
so
that
mad.
that hurt me less for me and more for like all the people I work with who do feel like,
Yeah,
I can't tell you how many of my clients are like, I should not still be this sad, or I can't believe I'm still
that
struggling
was me.
so much after
Yeah,
this loss. And a comment like that is why, this larger
yeah.
culture of how we kind of tell people
Back
how
up. You're fine. Yeah, yeah. Get over it. I mean, I feel like, unfortunately, the grief stages, which we obviously know were not even meant for the bereaved, um, have been repurposed into this thing that people think of almost in terms of like the way we think about a 12-step program. You go through these 5 stages in the weeks following your loved one's death, and then you're good. And that's just not true. And it's not all always sad. It's not always that heavy or that all consuming, but grief really is this repeated experience of learning how to live in the midst of a significant loss. Like, I'm sure you experienced some grief connected to the loss of your parents, even in this move that you're in the middle of, which is, and your parents have been gone for years, and you have little children, and like but like it doesn't matter. Like, you're allowed to feel it when you feel it, and every change tends to bring it up in some way. So yeah, you're constantly dealing with it in some fashion, and people need to start to really wrap their minds around that.
Yeah, Hope Edelman had a great book that came out last year called The After Grief. And it was, I don't know if you've checked it out, but it's really about the kind of like ripple effect of how loss stays with us throughout our lifetime, and
Yeah,
how
yeah,
we're not necessarily grieving and down on our knees and filled with all the usual
exactly.
emotions of grief, but like, yes, just me moving 2 decades after my mother's death, like I was just thinking about her yesterday and, feeling that loss in my
Yeah.
life. And so that's something that never goes away.
And now that you said that, I want to know, did you move that giant family picture?
Yeah, God, that thing just keeps coming with me. You wouldn't believe this stuff. I've moved across the country so many times. When you have two dead parents and no siblings, like you inherit all this
Oh,
stuff that you just feel like you can't get rid of. I've got like my parents' report cards and like just
oh
so much
wow.
stuff. And it's really sentimental stuff that I don't want to get rid of. But what Marissa's referring to is when I was like 7, we had a professional photographer come out and take like a family portrait, and it was like one of those mall photography studios that sent the photographer out, and then they liked the picture so much that they blew it up to like, I mean, museum size, and they hung it on the wall in the mall in their shop, and then they closed down at one point years later, and we would walk by it and always look at it and laugh. And then years later, they closed the shop and they asked us if we wanted it. So we ended up with this like room size photograph of our family that I now feel like I can't get rid of. But I'm not going to hang it on my wall.
Yeah, I needed to know if that made the move.
Yeah.
Also, Danielle says, in Black culture, we are taught to be strong and it's killing us. We penalize stoicism. Yeah, I mean, pedestalize stoicism. Okay. Yes, and I want to speak to that for a second, because it really is killing us. There is some research that I've been looking at in this book. I think it's called Skin Deep Resilience. And
Mhm.
it's basically about how more often than not, Black kids who are more likely, excuse me, than white kids to experience the death of a parent, they internalize and oftentimes continue to strive and move forward and never get diagnosed with anything in terms of like mental or physical health until decades later. And at that point it is generally something that is actually going to take years off of your life. So I am working really hard to be vocal about feelings and naming feelings, getting them out of your body, creating space for them, because yeah, our silence is absolutely killing us.
What is going to help with that? Like, where does that change start?
I think because, so a couple things that I've been playing around with in my book. One, I look at how I dealt with the loss of my mom versus how I dealt with the pregnancy loss. Loss of my mom, I was like, I just need to get through this, no space to fall apart. Tried not to like ask for extra things, just I was back at work 2 weeks later, I was like, it's fine, I'm good, whatever. I was a mess. I told you this, horrible anxiety, depression, all the things. I probably needed serious medication and a better therapist, but I digress. When we lost our pregnancy, I was just like, fuck this. I will tell anybody and everybody who will listen about how hard it is and how sick I've been and how I let somebody electrocute my uterus to try and get us like, I was like, here is everything, because I cannot hold on to this. And I realized that, when I was 25 and lost my mom, first generation college grad, working in finance where I was oftentimes the only woman, always the only Black person. And I didn't have a backup plan. Like if I stopped working, like I was just not going to have any money and like couldn't afford my apartment. And like I was much more fragile in like a broader sense and not as safe.
Yeah.
Whereas, you fast forward 12 years later, like I am in a position of relative safety, or as safe as I can be as a Black woman in America who's not named Oprah Winfrey, right? And I want us to be thinking about who we extend safety to, like how are we ensuring that people who are often marginalized are given the space that they need and the safety and support that they need to grieve. And that's part of why I think some of this needs to be on the policy front, and not like the interpersonal stuff matters and makes a difference. But I think we really need to examine how we are keeping people safe, big picture, so that they can carve out the space that they need to grieve. And, if you are a person of color and like you don't feel like you're being given that in whatever environment, work environment, family, friends, etc., claim it anyway,
Yeah.
because it's just like it will kill you, and it's not worth it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. There's a couple last questions here that I want to, or last comments and questions to hit on, but I really want, before we end, for you to tell us how your book is going and what's happening with that. But Lizzie says, this is interesting. I guess she has a question for both of us. I've heard Biden talk about a sense of purpose, civil service as an antidote to his grief. How do we think about our evolving sense of purpose and mission as it relates to our grief? How is that for you? That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, Lizzie knows this. I started a charity when my mom was dying because like I knew that I couldn't save my mom, but like maybe I could help save somebody else's.
Yeah.
So like I needed to throw myself into something that felt meaningful. And then, I left a career in finance that was going very well because again, I needed that meaning in my life after she died. And it continues, this, I'll get into the book, but like it's hard. And I feel like it is also really important because it is making me feel like I am using what I've learned from my loss and what I learned from my mom's life to hopefully help somebody else. Like that is, I know who I write for. And that's why I got so angry when that person made that comment on your Instagram, because I was like, she doesn't work for you. She's not writing for you. Like, go, bye.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Cheryl says she thinks of it as honoring her grief, not an antidote. I agree with that. Like, I think mine is also very much about honoring my losses and then just really trying to create meaning out of that, create change out of my experience. Like, what did I need that I didn't get? What do other people need that they're not getting right now? How can we use what we know? I mean, I remember being in grad school and getting my psychology degree, and all my fellow students kept saying, "Oh my God, death and grief, I'm not going to work in that field." And I was like, okay, well, if everybody in my grad program doesn't want to work in there and I do and I know a lot about it and I'm comfortable with it, then I have to do it, right? Like
Yeah.
that is my way of being of service, of like using this horrible thing that I've gone through and creating something meaningful out of it and useful.
Yes, yes, yes.
Um, redeeming. I'm looking at Tanya's comment about losing her parents and then losing her son. And there are so many more resources, Tanya's pointing out, than, when my mom died when I was 18, which was in 1997, there was nothing like there is now, like what there is now in terms of books, websites, support groups, like virtual stuff, talks about grief. It's incredible now and it's only growing. And I am also really grateful for it. So before we close, Marisa, tell us about your book and how's it going? For those who aren't familiar, tell us about the book. And then
So I am writing a book that's due in 7 weeks called Grief is Love.
Got this?
The book is focused on living with loss. Like it's grief is love, living with loss, because that's what we do. Like we're out here in the world, you're raising this beautiful family and moving and working and dealing with an anxious dog today. Like we have to figure out how to live with all of this grief. And so that is the focus of the book. What does that actually look like? How do we do that? And why is it important to figure out how to live with grief as opposed to just shutting it down or pretending like it doesn't exist? It's been really hard. Everyone said it was going to be hard, including you. I just didn't understand how hard, but writing the book forces me to go back and relive a lot of pain and trauma and personal grief and lots of thinking about my mom and the ways in which she suffered and racism and it's all the things.
It's hard on so many levels. I think it's not just hard in one way, like not just hard in the emotional way. It's hard just like writing the sentences, like,
Yeah, it's
um,
everything. And I'm working, so I work full time and have a decent full plate of clients. And then I'm also writing this book. And it's been really hard. I am back in weekly therapy and weekly acupuncture and just trying to get through it. And trying to be okay when I'm not okay because it's hard.
yeah,
So yeah, so that's self-compassion.
yeah,
I'm not good
totally.
at it.
Oh my gosh, Marissa, I adore you. I am so grateful for the work that you do in the world. Your mom would be
Yeah,
so proud of you.
thank you, thank you.
I'm so honored to have had you on today for this conversation. And I think we just need to talk like every week, whether it's
Yes,
publicly or personally.
yes, I
But
am.
I'm
I
glad you
am
could take the time
down.
to be here for our conversation. Thanks to everybody for all the comments and questions you brought to add depth to this. And thank you, of course, to Dara and to Reimagine for hosting these important conversations.
Oh,
Thank
and
you, thank you.
Marissa, I wasn't sure where to direct people to order your book. Like I took them to your website, but if there is a place, you can put it in the chat, or
Thank you, thank you.
we can send it in the follow-up email as
I
well.
was gonna say we're not there yet,
Okay.
but we will be there soon, and I'll make sure you have the link when we are there, Dara. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, it was, I loved every minute of this conversation and just really grateful that you both
Thank
had
you.
it today with us in the Reimagine community. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Absolutely, thank you.
More soon. Okay.
Great. Oh, and just everybody, if you go to the website, we have a bunch more holding space events up on the website, and there's more to come.
Yeah.
So please take a look, and we will also include some links in the follow-up email.
Thank you. All right, you guys. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye.